80 AD, the Roman Colosseum. The sun had barely risen above the marble pillars when the crowd started to gather. By midday, the stands were full. 50,000 Romans, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in togas and soaked in wine, eyes fixed on the center of the arena. The air buzzed with excitement, not fear, not disgust, excitement. Children sat on their fathers' laps. Vendors sold figs, bread, and spiced wine. Senators laughed behind veils of silk. Slaves fanned them, while musicians played flutes just beneath the emperor's seat. And in the middle of it all, one woman stood naked, shackled to a wooden frame. Her name wasn't remembered. No one wrote it down. She was just a symbol now. A prisoner, probably from a border province, accused of something that no longer mattered. Theft, rebellion, faith, her crime was irrelevant. Her punishment was the point. She was to become Pacify, the mythological queen who once fell in love with a bull. But this wasn't myth. This was Rome. Guards dragged a bizarre object into the arena, a wooden cow. At first, the crowd murmured. Children giggled. Then laughter erupted when the bull was brought in, snorting, massive, riled up with prodding spears and burning incense shoved in its nostrils. The animal had no idea what was happening, but the Romans did. The woman screamed. She begged. The chains rattled as she struggled, but the guards shoved her into the hollow frame of the wooden cow and sealed it shut. And then they waited. The bull, frenzied and aroused from pain, caught the scent and began mounting the wooden replica. The crowd howled in pleasure. Not horror, pleasure. Some threw roses. Others cheered every thrust like it was a sporting event. When the act was over, the guards opened the wooden cow. Blood dripped out before she did. Her body torn, her dignity destroyed. And then came the lions to finish what was left. This wasn't some dark secret. It wasn't hidden in whispers or denied by scholars. The poet Marshall wrote it down, word for word. We saw Pacify joined to the bull. It was treated as art. The inauguration of the greatest arena in the world wasn't marked by honor or courage. It was marked by rape, humiliation, and applause. Welcome to Rome. They tell you about gladiators, about brave warriors with gleaming armor fighting with honor under the eyes of Caesar. They make movies out of it. Men with morals, fights with meaning. But that was never the full truth. The Colosseum wasn't about glory. It was about control. Death not as punishment but as pleasure. Every blood-soaked spectacle was meant to teach Rome's citizens one thing. Rome has power. Over you, over life, over death, even over morality itself. By the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire had ballooned to over 60 million people. And in every major city, from Gaul to Judea, Carthage to Constantinople, there was one institution bigger than any temple, more central than any market, the arena. Over 250 amphitheaters across the empire, churning out death like a factory. And none more iconic than the Flavian Amphitheater, better known today as the Colosseum. On the day of its grand opening, Emperor Titus wanted the world to remember his name forever. So he gave them what they loved, 100 straight days of games. That's over 9,000 animals slaughtered, hundreds of gladiators, prisoners executed in bulk, and yes, public rape dressed as myth. This wasn't random violence. It was industrial-scale death. You might wonder, why? Why would any civilization do this? The answer is as cold as the stone beneath those marble seats: pleasure and obedience. Seneca, the philosopher, wrote after attending the games, I come home more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman, because I have been among humans. He wasn't exaggerating. Midday executions were considered casual. Criminals were tied to stakes, while starved lions were released into the arena. The people bet on how long the screams would last. Children laughed. Musicians played over the dying cries. And every Roman learned the same lesson: disobey, and this is your fate. Even the animals weren't just tools. They were statements. Rome imported lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from Egypt. They didn't parade them like treasures. They killed them. Slaughtered nature itself to show that no part of the world could resist Roman will. One giraffe was dragged from Nubia, the first one ever seen in Europe. They didn't understand it, so they gave it a name, Camelopardalis, a mix of camel and leopard. And then they tore it to pieces in front of a cheering crowd. No symbolism, no mercy, just spectacle. They called these shows venations, hunts. But they weren't hunts. They were mass executions of the natural world. And behind every show was the same unspoken message. If Rome can conquer the wild, it can conquer you. That was just the beginning. Forget what you think you know about gladiators. Rome told the world a beautiful lie, that these were warriors, that they lived by a code, that they fought with honor. Modern movies drank that lie like wine. Polished swords, dramatic battles, slow-motion deaths. But the truth was dirtier, crueler, far more staged. The arena was not a battlefield. It was a machine, carefully engineered to produce humiliation, not heroism. The crowd didn't want fair fights. They didn't come to see skill. They came to see imbalance, pain, collapse, failure. That's what made them cheer, and so Rome gave it to them. Picture this, the gates open, trumpets blare. A man stumbles into the sun, dressed like a joke. Painted face, a wooden sword, maybe a fake wig. He's not a gladiator. He's a condemned criminal, forced to wear the outfit of a retiarius, the net fighter. But his net is torn, and his trident is made of brittle wood. From the other side, a professional, armored, trained, silent. A secutor, designed specifically to defeat the retiarius. His helmet deflects nets. His short sword slices clean. The match is a lie, but the man has no choice. He runs, he screams. The crowd laughs. The professional waits, then strikes. The blood is real. The death is slow. That's the show. This wasn't sport. It was execution dressed as entertainment. The condemned didn't die in dignity. They died in costume. And every costume had meaning. Every fight was a message. Rome loved its symbols. Gladiators weren't just killers, they were actors. The Samnite gladiator wore armor that mocked a tribe Rome had crushed. The Thracian wore a curved sword and feathers, reminding the crowd of Eastern rebellions. Every time they were cut down, Rome reenacted its own victories, again and again, and sometimes they took it even further. Some matches weren't one-on-one. They were massacres. A group of slaves, barely armed, tossed into the arena against trained fighters. Or worse, against each other. The crowd watched them die in confusion, choking on dust and screams. Sometimes they were blindfolded, sometimes drunk. Sometimes promised freedom if they survived, which they never did, and if the crowd got bored. They just added animals, bears, wolves, bulls, all starved beforehand, all enraged. Gladiators with spears would dance around the chaos, prodding both man and beast. The floor would turn to mud from blood and spit and waste. The smell? Unbearable, but no one left. This was the part they loved most, and still, Rome kept pushing. They didn't just want death. They wanted stories. And so they invented the most twisted spectacle of all, damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. By midday, the real fights were over. That's when the freak shows began. Criminals weren't just killed. They were cast in roles. Thieves were tied to poles while hyenas tore at their legs. Arsonists were burned alive, wrapped in pitch-soaked cloaks and lit like torches. Traitors were forced to crawl on all fours, while soldiers whipped them toward the lions. Every execution mirrored a moral tale. It was theater, with living, unwilling actors. And the message was always the same. Rome punishes. Rome controls. Rome decides who lives and dies, and how. One senator once joked that the only difference between a criminal and a mythological villain was the costume. That was the level of cruelty. They made jokes out of torture. The records tell us of one man, a foreigner condemned to die, who was dressed as Icarus, the boy who flew too close to the sun. They gave him wings made of wax and feathers, suspended him with a crude rope system. He flew for maybe 5 seconds, then fell into a pit of spears. The crowd clapped like it was a festival. Another man played Orpheus, the legendary musician. They gave him a lyre, told him to sing to the animals. The beasts didn't listen. A bear was released and mauled him mid-performance. The poet Martial was there. He wrote, "If he had delayed, the beasts might have obeyed." And then there was her, the one they called Pacify. The woman forced into the wooden cow. That wasn't a one-time show. Rome repeated it again and again, sometimes with different myths, sometimes with real animals, always with screams, always with applause. The myth was twisted until it bled, and the crowd never got tired of it. By now, you've seen the screams. You've seen the mock battles, the forced myths, the engineered deaths. But there was something else that made Roman arenas more than just theaters of pain. Something more primal, more terrifying, the animals. They were not simply beasts. In Rome, they were symbols, tools, living weapons sharpened by starvation and fury, paraded in cages and unleashed before a crowd hungry for one thing: spectacle. This wasn't about nature. This was about dominance. The animals came from everywhere. Rome's borders stretched from the misty forests of Germania to the deserts of North Africa, from the Nile to the mountains of Armenia. And from each corner of this vast empire, animals were dragged in chains toward death. Lions from the Atlas Mountains, leopards from Persia, elephants from Carthage, tigers from India, ostriches from Nubia, bears from Gaul, crocodiles floated down from the Nile. Even hippos and giraffes, creatures Romans couldn't even name, were caged, weakened, and fed into the Colosseum like kindling to a fire. The logistics were insane. Carts creaked over desert paths, laden with iron cages. Ships were modified to transport big cats. Entire caravans of slaves were dedicated to this purpose alone, transporting terror alive. Thousands of miles, weeks of travel, all for a moment that would last less than a minute in the arena. But the message was never subtle. Rome didn't just kill people. It conquered nature itself. Every animal torn apart was a reminder: if we can kill this, we can kill you. They called the shows venationes, hunts. A lie. There was no hunt, no sport, no fairness. The animals were starved beforehand, dehydrated, sometimes blinded, sometimes stabbed just enough to make them angry, but not weak. They were already dying before they hit the sand. They were released into the arena, forced to fight slaves, prisoners, or trained hunters called bestiarii. These men were armed, usually, but not always. Sometimes they were condemned criminals handed sticks. Sometimes they were professional killers who danced and posed like performers. But always, always the animal died. That was the point. Rome didn't want a close fight. It wanted a bloody kill. The Colosseum's opening games under Emperor Titus slaughtered over 9,000 animals in one celebration. That's 90 per day. Every kill, a cheer. Every roar, a laugh. Archaeologists later dug up bones beneath the arena floor. Lion skulls scarred by blades, elephant femurs fractured deliberately. Many had etchings showing that they were deliberately starved or wounded before battle, not just for safety. For entertainment value, the bloodier the death, the louder the applause. But it wasn't just combat. Sometimes the animals weren't the aggressors. They were the executioners. That's where things turned sick. Rome used animals to kill humans in ways that mirrored punishment through irony. A man who set fires, burned alive a thief, torn apart by jackals. A soldier who deserted his post, chained in the arena as a bear gnawed his legs off. They even used trained bulls to gore prisoners, tied to wooden stakes. And it wasn't random. The bulls were trained to attack movement. Prisoners would struggle and scream, and the animal would charge. The crowd would bet on how long it took for the first horn to split a rib. Some beasts were used in mock performances that blurred the line between myth, murder, and theater. One of the most horrific, a stage play of Orpheus, the Greek musician who could charm animals with his lyre. The prisoner was forced to sing in the center of the arena, surrounded by beasts. The crowd laughed as lions circled him. Then they unleashed a bear. It tore his head off mid-song. They didn't even pause the music, but there was something even worse than all of this: the ecological destruction. Because the Romans didn't just kill animals, they extinguished them. Pliny the Elder, a Roman naturalist, warned even then that rare species were disappearing. Lions were vanishing from their native regions, elephants from the Sahara, leopards from the east. Some species may have been driven to extinction purely because of these shows. Thousands killed, not for food, not for survival, but for the audience's appetite for blood. This was mass extinction as entertainment, and when the creatures ran out, Rome paid more, sent more ships, offered gold and silver to distant kingdoms. They needed fresh beasts daily, for the population was addicted. By the 2nd century, more money was spent on animal shows than roads, schools, or military infrastructure. Rome was bleeding its empire to keep the crowd entertained. At first, Rome's executions were about killing. But that wasn't enough. The empire wanted more than death. It wanted narrative. A twisted theater where the condemned weren't just victims, they were characters. Their suffering became story. Their pain became myth, and so the mythological executions were born. This was where cruelty became art. It started simply. A criminal is sentenced to death, but instead of a clean blade or a lion's jaws, he's handed a costume, told he will play a god, a hero, a legend. And then, in front of 50,000 cheering Romans, he dies in a scene lifted from Rome's most sacred stories. Except there's no acting, no illusions, no escape. Take the story of Orpheus, which the arena twisted into a joke. In myth, Orpheus could calm animals with his music. In the Colosseum, a prisoner was dressed in robes, given a lyre, and told to play. At first, the animals didn't attack. They walked around him, sniffed. The crowd leaned forward. Then the handlers released a bear. The prisoner kept playing. He was probably told not to stop, not to scream. Maybe he thought if he played well enough, they might spare him. They didn't. Martial, the poet, wrote, "If he had delayed, the beasts would have obeyed." But he was torn apart. Another prisoner was dressed as Daedalus' son, Icarus. They tied crude wings to his arms, covered him in feathers and wax, and suspended him by ropes from the top of the arena. They raised him slowly, an illusion of flight, while the crowd pointed and laughed. Then the ropes were cut. He fell, screaming, not into water, but onto sharpened spikes. The myth said Icarus flew too close to the sun. Rome made sure the only thing he touched was steel, but it was the pacify execution that truly crossed every line. We've talked about it before. A woman condemned to reenact a legend. The myth said Queen Pasiphae fell in love with a bull possessed by divine lust. But Rome didn't care about symbolism. They took a real woman, stripped her naked, shoved her into a mechanical wooden cow built by slaves. Then they released a live bull into the arena. The animal, drugged and whipped into a frenzy, mounted the fake cow. The woman inside could hear it all, feel it. The pressure, the weight, the trembling of the wood as the crowd howled. When they opened the cow, she was unconscious, bloody, humiliated. Then they let the lions in to finish her. This was execution as pornography. Death as voyeurism. Children watched. Senators clapped. And the empire carried on. And this wasn't rare. Tertullian, an early Christian writer, bitterly recorded that female prisoners were often dressed as priestesses before being publicly violated, then murdered. They weren't killed as themselves. They were forced to die as symbols, villains, fallen queens, or even goddesses. Each death a message. Rome owns the myths. Rome owns your body. Rome owns your end. The arena wasn't punishing people anymore. It was rewriting stories. Every tale twisted, every ending redrawn in blood. There's something else to understand here. These executions weren't meant to shock. They were meant to normalize. When 50,000 people watched a man burned alive while playing Prometheus, it became ritual. When a woman was raped and torn apart while dressed as a goddess, it became routine. And when the crowd cheered, they became complicit. This is how Rome taught obedience, through pleasure, through myth, through horror disguised as entertainment. And here's the deeper cruelty. These shows didn't happen in dark corners. They weren't hidden in dungeons. They were scheduled, budgeted, publicized. They happened under clear skies, in beautiful marble arenas, with fresh wine and roasted meats being sold nearby. The audience paid for tickets. They wore jewelry. They brought their kids. They knew what was coming, and they still came back. At first, Rome's executions were about killing. But that wasn't enough. The empire wanted more than death. It wanted narrative. A twisted theater where the condemned weren't just victims, they were characters. Their suffering became story. Their pain became myth, and so the mythological executions were born. This was where cruelty became art. It started simply. A criminal is sentenced to death, but instead of a clean blade or a lion's jaws, he's handed a costume, told he will play a god, a hero, a legend. And then, in front of 50,000 cheering Romans, he dies in a scene lifted from Rome's most sacred stories. Except there's no acting, no illusions, no escape. Take the story of Orpheus, which the arena twisted into a joke. In myth, Orpheus could calm animals with his music. In the Colosseum, a prisoner was dressed in robes, given a lyre, and told to play. At first, the animals didn't attack. They walked around him, sniffed. The crowd leaned forward. Then the handlers released a bear. The prisoner kept playing. He was probably told not to stop, not to scream. Maybe he thought if he played well enough, they might spare him. They didn't. Martial, the poet, wrote, "If he had delayed, the beasts would have obeyed." But he was torn apart. Another prisoner was dressed as Daedalus's son, Icarus. They tied crude wings to his arms, covered him in feathers and wax, and suspended him by ropes from the top of the arena. They raised him slowly, an illusion of flight, while the crowd pointed and laughed. Then the ropes were cut. He fell, screaming, not into water, but onto sharpened spikes. The myth said Icarus flew too close to the sun. Rome made sure the only thing he touched was steel, but it was the pacify execution that truly crossed every line. We've talked about it before. A woman condemned to reenact a legend. The myth said Queen Pasiphae fell in love with a bull possessed by divine lust. But Rome didn't care about symbolism. They took a real woman, stripped her naked, shoved her into a mechanical wooden cow built by slaves. Then they released a live bull into the arena. The animal, drugged and whipped into a frenzy, mounted the fake cow. The woman inside could hear it all, feel it. The pressure, the weight, the trembling of the wood as the crowd howled. When they opened the cow, she was unconscious, bloody, humiliated. Then they let the lions in to finish her. This was execution as pornography. Death as voyeurism. Children watched. Senators clapped. And the empire carried on. And this wasn't rare. Tertullian, an early Christian writer, bitterly recorded that female prisoners were often dressed as priestesses before being publicly violated. Then murdered. They weren't killed as themselves. They were forced to die as symbols, villains, fallen queens, or even goddesses, each death a message. Rome owns the myths. Rome owns your body. Rome owns your end. The arena wasn't punishing people anymore. It was rewriting stories. Every tale twisted, every ending redrawn in blood. There's something else to understand here. These executions weren't meant to shock. They were meant to normalize. When 50,000 people watched a man burned alive while playing Prometheus, it became ritual. When a woman was raped and torn apart while dressed as a goddess, it became routine. And when the crowd cheered, they became complicit. This is how Rome taught obedience, through pleasure, through myth, through horror disguised as entertainment. And here's the deeper cruelty. These shows didn't happen in dark corners. They weren't hidden in dungeons. They were scheduled, budgeted, publicized. They happened under clear skies, in beautiful marble arenas, with fresh wine and roasted meats being sold nearby. The audience paid for tickets. They wore jewelry. They brought their kids. They knew what was coming, and they still came back. It wasn't enough for Rome to kill on land. That had become routine, predictable. And so, like everything else in the empire, death had to evolve. What if men could die at sea without leaving the city? That's how the Naumachia were born, mock naval battles staged for public entertainment. These weren't plays. They were real ships, real weapons, and real men fighting to the death on man-made lakes, all for a crowd that demanded more blood. The first known Naumachia was staged by Julius Caesar in 46 BC. To celebrate his victories, he ordered a massive basin dug near the river Tiber. It was enormous, 800 feet long, fed by special aqueducts just to keep it filled. On it, Caesar placed 2 full fleets, 1 Tyrian, 1 Egyptian, each manned not by actors, but by prisoners of war. Captives, thieves, rebels, condemned to die as entertainment. They were handed real weapons. They boarded real ships, but they had no chance. The archers were already waiting. On shore, Roman soldiers lined up with ballistae, catapults, and flaming arrows. If the prisoners refused to fight, they were burned alive in their boats. If they jumped overboard, they drowned under the weight of their armor. Thousands died in a fake war that looked exactly like the real thing. And the crowd went home satisfied. The emperors learned quickly. Naval blood sold better than any myth. Augustus went even bigger. In 2 BC, he ordered the construction of a basin nearly 2,000 feet wide, fed by an aqueduct built solely for this event. The water was deep, cold, fast-moving. Inside, 30 warships packed with prisoners. They were told to fight like enemies, but they had no strategy. No training, just desperation. The ships collided, bodies splashed. Screams echoed over the water. When the victors limped ashore, blood-soaked and gasping, the crowd erupted in cheers, not because of who won, but because they had died beautifully. It wasn't war. It was performance. Then came Claudius. In 52 AD, the emperor went further than anyone ever had. He ordered his engineers to drain Lake Fucine, a massive body of water nestled in the Apennine Mountains. It took years. Thousands of slaves. Entire towns were displaced, not for infrastructure, not for irrigation, for a show. When it was ready, the lake was ringed with bleachers, guards, musicians, vendors. Senators sat under silk canopies. Commoners packed the hills. And in the center, thousands of prisoners shoved onto ships, handed weapons, and given a choice, kill or be killed. Before the battle began, they stood in the boats and shouted one of the most famous lines in Roman history, Ave Caesar, moritur te salutant. Hail Caesar, we who are about to die salute you. It wasn't courage. It was resignation. They knew they wouldn't survive. And they didn't. The battle raged for hours. Arrows blackened the sky. Fire spread from ship to ship. Some men drowned. Others were hacked to pieces and fed to the eels. When it was over, the lake was red, floating with bodies. And Claudius smiled. The Colosseum wasn't exempt. Though smaller than the lakes, the arena itself was designed with ingenious plumbing. Engineers built a complex system of drainable channels beneath the sand. With enough water, they could flood the entire floor, turning it into a miniature sea. By the 2nd century, naumachii were being staged inside the Colosseum. Imagine it. Thousands in the stands, water lapping at the edges, men rowing ships in circles, while others climbed aboard with blades and grappling hooks. Some wore theatrical armor, dressed as Trojans or Greeks or pirates. The stories were fictional, but the dying was real. Blood mixed with salt water. Metal clashed under painted sails, and children clapped as bodies floated face down in their wine-colored sea. This wasn't madness, it was message. Rome could conquer the oceans, even if it had to build them first. Rome could turn a lake into a battlefield. Rome could make the unnatural feel inevitable. They didn't just control land, or people, or ideas. They controlled nature itself. Every time an emperor staged a naval battle, he wasn't just entertaining the crowd. He was reminding them, you live in a world where death is a choice we give you, not one you make for yourself. By now, the Colosseum had seen everything. Men torn to pieces, women raped and fed to beasts, animals drowned in fake oceans, thousands dead, all for applause. But Rome wasn't done. It never was. Because eventually the emperors themselves wanted to be part of the spectacle, not as rulers, not as judges, but as gladiators, and none craved the spotlight more than one man, Commodus. Born in 161 AD, Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor. His father was serious, stoic. He saw ruling as duty. Commodus saw it as a stage. He wanted fame. Not as a thinker, not as a builder, but as a killer. And the Colosseum became his favorite mirror. He didn't just attend the games. He starred in them, dressed in lion skins, wielding silver swords, oiled and sculpted like a god. He entered the arena, not as Caesar, but as Hercules reborn. The crowd didn't cheer. They obeyed, because when the emperor fights, clapping is compulsory. Here's what the records tell us. Commodus fought in the arena 735 times. Not once did he lose. Not once did he take a real risk. Every opponent was weakened beforehand, crippled, drugged, or unarmed. Sometimes blindfolded. Sometimes tied to stakes. Some were even hobbled, so they couldn't run. Commodus would strut across the sand, toss his cape, and plunge his sword into chests already marked for death. One time, he lined up a group of amputees, dressed them in animal skins, and hunted them down with arrows, calling it a venatio, a beast hunt. They weren't beasts. They were men. But he pretended. The treasury bled for it. Each performance cost the empire 1,000,000 sesterces, and Commodus demanded tribute from the provinces just to fund his private theatre of blood. Cassius Dio, a Roman historian, watched in disgust. He wrote, "He killed with such ease, yet expected thunderous praise, as if slaying the helpless was a divine act, and it wasn't just men. Commodus slaughtered animals too, hundreds at a time, giraffes, lions, elephants, all crippled before release. He even claimed to have killed 100 lions with a single spear in one afternoon. No one questioned it. To question was to die. The emperor's obsession with performance seeped into everything. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He renamed the months after his own titles. Even the legions were forced to call him Hercules Invictus. He wasn't leading an empire. He was writing a fantasy, with himself at the center, and the arena. That was his stage, his church. His mirror. There were whispers, of course. Senators gritted their teeth. Philosophers shook their heads. But they all stayed silent. Because silence was safer than a sword. One man who mocked Commodus in public was dragged into the arena the next day, forced to fight a wild boar with nothing but a stick. He didn't last long. The worst wasn't what Commodus did. It was how Rome accepted it. A city that once prided itself on discipline and virtue now cheered for an emperor who played with corpses, a ruler who butchered prisoners like props, a god in his own mind with a theater full of willing believers. Violence wasn't just normal now. It was fashionable. The emperor kills. So what? The crowd eats and drinks and laughs. The sand runs red and still they come back. But nothing corrupts forever. Eventually, the bloodlust turns inward. In 192 AD, Commodus was assassinated, poisoned, then strangled in his bath. The gladiator emperor died not with a sword in his hand, but with betrayal at his back. The Senate ordered his statues torn down, his name erased, his madness buried. But the Colosseum, it stayed. The shows continued. The blood kept flowing. Because even if the emperor changed, the people never stopped craving the spectacle. By now, the Colosseum wasn't just a place of death. It was a stage where Rome performed its power. Not only through violence, but through messaging. Every scream was scripted, every death choreographed. And the crowd? They weren't just watching. They were learning, because the arena had a new purpose now. Crush the enemies of Rome in full public view. And those enemies were Christians, slaves, rebels, foreigners, anyone who said no. To Rome, death was never just punishment. It was propaganda, and Christians became the perfect targets. They refused to bow to the gods. They rejected imperial authority. They gathered in secret, spoke of love, mercy, resurrection, all things that mocked Rome's pride and brutality. So the empire made them pay, publicly, painfully, and worst of all, theatrically. Imagine this. Midday in the Colosseum. The crowd restless after a long morning of beast hunts. Vendors refill wineskins. Children laugh. Musicians play soft flutes, and then the condemned are brought out. They are Christians, men and women, some old, some barely teenagers. They are stripped, tied to wooden crosses, or bound to stakes soaked in pitch. There is no fight, no struggle. Just ritual. Flames are lit one by one. They burn alive. Their bodies flail, their mouths open in screams that no one hears over the cheering. Tertullian, a Christian writer, called them living torches. He wasn't exaggerating. That's exactly what they were. Human lamps lighting up the arena as the sun began to set, but Rome didn't stop there. Some Christians were thrown to lions, but not just released into the pit, no, that would be too clean. First, they were dressed up, as priests or clowns, or figures from Roman mythology, the idea. Humiliate them. Break their beliefs before they broke their bodies. One woman was forced to act as Dirce, a mythological queen who was tied to a wild bull and dragged until her bones shattered. Except this wasn't a play. The bull was real. So were the chains. And so was her death. The crowd loved it. The arena sent a clear message: worship our gods. Follow our rules. Or suffer as entertainment. This was religious persecution wrapped in applause. And the crowd, they weren't innocents. They shouted. They laughed. They bet on who would scream the longest. And then they went home, fed and satisfied. But it wasn't just Christians. Slaves were executed for crimes they didn't commit. If a noble was assassinated, all his slaves, even the innocent, were tortured and killed. To remind others what silence costs, foreigners, especially from Judea, Gaul, Britannia, were paraded through the streets in chains, then butchered in the sand while actors mocked their cultures. Rome didn't just kill you. It erased your identity, laughed at your gods, then used your body as a cautionary tale. And here's what made it all worse. These weren't hidden crimes. They were family events. Senators brought their wives. Parents brought their children. Emperors watched with pride. One record from Pliny the Younger describes a Roman noble asking to postpone an execution because his daughter was running late and he didn't want her to miss it. This was the moral collapse of a civilization, dressed in marble and gold. The empire that gave the world aqueducts, law, and architecture also lit human beings on fire for fun. And in the smoke rising from the arena, in the ashes of the dead, something dark and quiet began to grow, a seed of doubt. Some Romans, just a few at first, began to feel it. A question rising in their hearts: what kind of society cheers while innocence burns? But by then, the damage was done. By now you've seen what Rome truly was, not just a city of marble, law, and empire, but a civilization addicted to pain, not just causing it, but celebrating it. And like any addiction, it came with a price, because eventually all the bloodshed, all the screaming, all the twisted pleasure, it turned inward. And it started to rot the empire from the inside out. Let's go back to the Colosseum. It stood proud in the heart of Rome, a symbol of might, of control, of glory. 50,000 seats, vaulted arches, and beneath it miles of tunnels holding cages, pulleys, weapons, bodies. But none of it was built to last, because cruelty never does. The arena was filled almost daily. That meant animals had to be shipped in every week. Condemned prisoners had to be found, chained, trained, or not trained at all. Slaves had to clean the blood before it dried. Engineers had to flood it, drain it, reset it. It was a full-time factory of death. And death is expensive. By the 3rd century AD, Rome was spending more on arena games than its own military. More on blood than on food. More on animal shows than on roads, schools, or health. Emperors emptied the treasury just to host one spectacular festival that would outshine the last. And if they didn't, the crowd turned, fast. Gratitude didn't exist, only appetite. That's what Juvenal meant when he mocked Rome with 2 words: panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Keep the people fed. Keep the blood flowing, and they'll stay quiet. They'll obey until they don't, because the violence didn't stay in the arena. It leaked out. Senators began assassinating each other to gain power. Soldiers turned on their commanders. Emperors rose and fell, not by votes or lineage, but by murder. By the end of the 3rd century, Rome had over 20 emperors in 50 years. Most were killed. Some by the sword, others by their own guards. Why? Because Rome trained its people to love violence, to expect it, To crave it when things got boring. Even the crowd changed. The same citizens who once cheered for discipline, for honor, for military glory, now cheered for naked women fighting dwarves, for cripples thrown to hyenas, for children dressed as gods and slaughtered for myth. It wasn't entertainment anymore. It was decay. A population that had once built aqueducts and libraries now demanded more wine, more screams, more meat on the sand. The shows got cheaper, the victims younger, the audience more savage, and slowly Rome began to crumble. By the 5th century, the Colosseum was no longer packed. Funds had dried. The borders were collapsing. The crowds thinned, not because they became better people, but because they were hungry. The bread was gone, and the circuses didn't matter without it. And then came the final blow, not from inside, but from the outside. The barbarians, the very tribes Rome once mocked in the arena, marched on the city, looted it, burned it, and when they reached the Colosseum, they left it standing, because even they knew Rome had already destroyed itself. Today, the Colosseum is silent. Its sand is clean, its tunnels dark. Tourists walk its halls and take pictures. They talk about gladiators, about chariots, about Roman greatness, but they rarely talk about the woman raped in the wooden cow, or the man forced to play Orpheus and mauled mid-song, or the Christians burned like candles while senators toasted wine, because we don't like remembering what entertainment really meant in ancient Rome. But we should, because there's a warning carved into every broken pillar of that arena, a message not written in marble, but in blood. A civilization that celebrates cruelty will eventually drown in it. Rome thought power was eternal. But the truth? Power is fragile. It dies the moment people trade virtue for applause. And in the end, Rome didn't fall to enemies. It fell to its own reflection.